Hello. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, all esteemed colleagues, partners, and friends from across the region. Welcome to the official launch of the pre-election assessment report for the first BARMM Parliamentary Elections, jointly conducted by ANFREL, that is Asian Network for Free Elections, and the NDI, that is National Democratic Institute. I am Dr. Manjesh Rana, Senior Program Officer for International Election Observation at ANFREL, and I'm honored to serve as your moderator today. We are joined by an extraordinary group of participants. Happy to share that this group includes representatives from local and international civil society, election management bodies, diplomatic missions, and members of the media. So today we are going to present key findings from our multi-week field deployment across the region of BARMM, examining the legal framework, electoral administration, campaign dynamics, representation, and security environment ahead of the landmark elections. So to open today's proceedings with context on ANFREL's and NDI's joint mission and our long-standing commitment to electoral integrity in post-conflict and autonomous contexts, it is my privilege to introduce Ms. Brisa Rosales. So Brisa serves as the Executive Director of ANFREL, leading regional initiatives to strengthen electoral integrity, democratic governance, and citizen observation across Asia. She brings over 12 years of expertise in election observation and legal reform across Asia, having previously served as Senior Program Director at Lente in the Philippines and led observation missions in several Asian countries, which include Indonesia, Thailand, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Tibet. So let's welcome Brisa Rosales. Over to you, Brisa.
Thank you, Rana. Good morning to all election stakeholders from COMELEC, to our security forces, the members of the regional political parties, candidates coming from the Bangsamoro Transition Authority agencies, ministries, partner organizations from the region, civil society organizations, media. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you all for joining us. So of course, my assignment and probably also Manpreet's assignment today is to provide context on how ANFREL-NDI and NDI approach this mission and why our previous work in the region is relevant to the first BARMM parliamentary elections. So ANFREL, of course, has observed elections across Asia for nearly 3 decades, including the elections taking place in context of political transition, conflict, and peace building. And in that sense, of course, our engagement in the Bangsamoro is both new and familiar. So it is new because this is the first regular parliamentary election in the BARMM. There is a new electoral system, a developing party system, and institutions that are still establishing their roles within the transition. But the broader context, of course, is not entirely new to ANFREL. ANFREL has observed the 2008 elections in the ARM then, Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, or ARMM, and we have seen, of course, the long-standing challenges surrounding elections in the region. So the influence of political families, the local power structures, electoral violence, and security concerns. We have heard, of course, of uneven access to information, questions of political participation and representation, and the difficulties of ensuring that voters are able to exercise a genuinely free and informed choice. And having that experience allow us to ask a useful question. What has fundamentally changed, and which challenges have persisted or simply taken new forms? So there's another regional experience that is relevant to answer that question. Because in 2006, as you can see in our screen, ANFREL observed the elections in Aceh, Indonesia, following the Helsinki Peace Agreement. And ACHE's transition was, of course, different from the BARMM and what we are experiencing in the Bangsamoro region right now. And of course, we should not overstate the comparison. But of course, it provided us an important regional example of how a peace agreement could move toward political participation and electoral competition. ALCHE also became one of the experiences examined during the Bangsamoro peace process. And of course, Malaysia is another important part of this regional context. Its long role as a facilitator of the negotiations between the Philippine government and the MILF, of course, it informed us, it reminded us that the Bangsamoro transition did not develop in isolation. And for ANFREL, these experiences provided context, but of course, this is for us to acknowledge that they are not templates. We are not here to compare BARMM mechanically with the former ARMM or with ACHE. So, and this is where we want to dig deeper into some of the older problems we have observed. And because as you can see also, the experiences monitoring the elections from 2022 to 2025 elections just last year, so it helped us a lot to frame the election observation mission. And I should also emphasize that this is a joint ANFREL-NDI mission. Our colleagues from the NDI bring their own experience and analytical perspectives to this particular election observation mission. And of course, probably we can go to the next slide. Yeah. So for the first phase of the mission, oh no, this is last year, wherein the supposed October 2025 elections, wherein we also did our pre-election assessment, but we were not able to publish the report because of the postponement. And now we, of course, we have concluded the first phase of the mission, doing that from 18th to 29th of July, wherein our team was able to conduct 105 consultations, key informant interviews, and 12 focus group discussions across the board. And we met with different election stakeholders and officials who are with us today, civil society organizations, and all of the election stakeholders that I have mentioned earlier. And of course, importantly, we did this before the formal campaign period began. So that allowed us to establish a baseline for us to better understand the legal and institutional preparations, the political environment, and the concerns already emerging before parties and candidates entered the formal campaign period. Next slide, please. Yeah, I have already mentioned about this, but probably we can go to the methodology part. Okay, thank you. So of course, for the mission methodology, we of course conducted a legal and institutional analysis, the purposive field deployment across BARMM, and we have did key informant interviews and focus group discussions to be informed of those key areas and the cross-cutting assessment priorities with regard to broader political participation and electoral and political violence. To end this context setting and a sort of discussion of the methodology, I also wanted to emphasize the word pre-election assessment, because this report is not a final judgment on the BARMM elections. Exactly 2 weeks before election day, because today is first day of September. So this pre-election assessment captures where the process stands at this stage. So it identifies the progress, the concerns, and the issues that we believe deserve attention, while there's still time for institutions, the political actors, and other stakeholders to respond. And it also provides the baseline for the second phase of our mission, wherein I will mention the plans of ANFREL and NDI for the short-term observation for the election day and immediate post-election assessment. So with that context, I hope I was able to provide information on where we are now and what we have done so far. So yeah, so thank you so much and thank you for listening. Back to you, Rana.
Thank you very much, Priza, for providing the viewers with the context. Next, I'm pleased to welcome Mr. Manpreet Singh Anand for opening reflections. So just to introduce Manpreet, he is the Regional Director for the Asia Pacific at the NDI, a position that he has held since 2019. He leads NDI's work in Asia and brings extensive foreign policy and governance experience, having previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for South Asia and Deputy Assistant Administrator at US8. Throughout his distinguished career, spanning the public, private, and academic sectors, he has been a prominent leader in diplomacy, international development, foreign policy, and national security. So let's welcome Mr. Manpreet Singh Anand. Over to you, Manpreet, and Sat Shri Akal.
Sat Shri Akal, and good morning. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. And thank you, Briza, for providing such a comprehensive presentation about the context within which this mission is being conducted. It's really wonderful to be a part of this webinar, and frankly, for NDI to be a part of this mission as a whole. For those who may be less familiar with the National Democratic Institute, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization based in the United States, but we have been working across the Asia-Pacific region and in the Philippines specifically for around 40 years. And our mission is simple. We have a belief that a world rooted in freedom, where people have a say in how they are governed and leaders are held accountable to their people, that's a world that fosters more stability, more security, and more prosperity for everyone. And the way in which NDI supports this type of agenda is multifold. We do work that ranges very different areas. We work with political parties. We strengthen parliamentary functions. We partner with civil society organizations. And important for this discussion, we support various election processes. And it is in this area where NDI has built a global track record that is quite relevant for today's conversation. In fact, over the past 40 years, NDI has conducted more than 250 election observation missions in more than 50 countries. Now, NDI's approach to election-related programming really seeks to try to maximize the opportunities that elections present. And in that way, our focus is really on promoting the integrity of electoral and political processes based both on international standards as well as the ground realities and practicalities of mobilizing citizen participation. And so, as we do with other observation missions, this joint ANFREL-NDI mission is being conducted independently, impartially, and in accordance with the Declaration of Principles for International Election Observation, and of course, the COMELEC accreditation guidelines for international observers. So it is in this way that we try to ensure that our election-related activities are tailored to the broader political process, but within each specific regional context. Now, while today's webinar is, of course, about a technical assessment mission, genuine elections are not merely a technical endeavor. We very much believe they are a fundamental human right linked to a broad array of institutions and the ability of citizens to exercise their civil and political rights. And this is really what makes these upcoming elections so important, given that they are the first parliamentary elections in BARMM's history. Our hope is that these elections are just the beginning of creating a vehicle for the participation of all citizens in that democratic process, as they help to build the capacities that are central to achieving accountable democratic governance. Of course, elections are also a way and a means for mitigating against the risk of violent conflict and, of course, advancing human security. It is really these twin objectives, the political participation of all citizens and implementing a political process that reflects the will of the people through nonviolent means, that form the basis of our work in this technical assessment mission. And it is in this context that NDI has been so proud to work with our longstanding partner, ANFREL, to deploy this technical assessment mission ahead of the first regulatory parliamentary elections in Bangsamoro. As I mentioned, these elections really do mark a significant milestone, given that they are the first parliamentary elections since the ratification of the Bangsamoro Organic Law. And building on both ANFREL and NDI's longstanding engagement in the BARMM, our mission is focusing in those two critical areas, political participation and security in the elections. We are, through this mission, examining the structural and practical barriers to the participation of a number of different groups, be it women, youth, non-Moro indigenous peoples, persons with disabilities, internally displaced persons, and other marginalized communities. The mission is also focused on assessing electoral and political violence, including conflict dynamics, security conditions, and other vulnerabilities. And so this mission will focus on a number of key aspects of the electoral process before, during, and immediately after Election Day. Now, we are coordinating from Cotabato City a number of long-term observer teams who are being deployed across all 5 BARMM provinces, as well as the special geographic areas. And we will look forward to their observation and broader assessment. Now, as we have done with all technical assessment missions, the joint mission will engage with a broad range of stakeholders. And when I say broad, it is broad. This includes the Comelec, of course, a number of Bangsamoro institutions, a multitude of national and local government agencies, political parties, candidates, civil society organizations, citizen election observers, security institutions, peace process actors, media practitioners, development partners. The list goes on and on to ensure that the assessment really reflects the diverse perspectives across the BARMM. Frankly, it is one of the most important political processes that you can have in a functioning democracy, because it connects almost all of the institutions and stakeholders of democratic society. That's what makes this work so important. Now, I'll just close by saying, of course, the mission will present its findings and actionable recommendations aimed at strengthening electoral integrity and democratic governance and peace building. But I'd be remiss if I also didn't mention that this work could not have been possible without the generous support of the National Endowment for Democracy. So thanks for giving me an opportunity to represent NDI in this important session, and I look forward to the rest of the webinar.
Thank you so much, Manpreet, for providing the context of the strong work which NDI has been doing in the region, as well as providing a detailed context of the current mission. We will now move to the primary feature of today's event, that is the presentation of our pre-election assessment report, presenting our findings today, we have our core team, that is our electoral analysts with us. This includes Ms. Asia Trilvina, Mr. Amal Veer, and Ms. May Gladys Botoy. Together, they led the technical analysis during our 12-day field deployment across the 5 BARMM provinces. I won't go into the details as Manpreet has already covered what all we did and how we did it, including the deployment areas and the topics or themes that we covered. So they will now walk us through our findings across different sections, including legal framework, electoral administration, campaign dynamics, representation, as well as electoral security. So over to you, team. So may I kindly invite Amel to begin with the presentation. Over to you, Amel.
Thank you, Rana. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining. It's my pleasure to begin this presentation of the mission's findings. I would like to start by mentioning that the pre-election assessment report is now live on ANFREL's website, so please feel free to access it as well. What you will see here will be a succinct presentation of a quite bulky report, so if you're really interested, feel free to look at the full text. And as previously mentioned, we will also follow up with a final report post-election that will contain more recommendations and a even larger assessment. If we can please move on to the next slide. I will begin by mentioning the background of these elections, which is obviously the peace process in the Bank Samoro. After successive postponements, these first Bank Samoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao elections will be held finally on September 14. Those and the subsequent transition to an elected parliament will represent a significant milestone in the implementation of the political track of the peace process for the Bank Samoro. And that is a development that is broadly supported by all stakeholders engaged by the mission. The perceived fairness and credibility of the upcoming elections will also be crucial for the acceptance of its outcomes, for post-election stability, and for the continuation of the peace process. At the same time, there remain important commitments under the normalization track of the peace process, which include, for instance, the provision of socio-economic support to former combatants and progress on transitional justice. So while these elections are a significant development, they should not be alone considered as the completion of the peace process, but only as a component on the political track. Moving on to the legal framework, and the next slide, please. These elections take place under a framework defined by the Bank Samoro Organic Law and the Bank Samoro Electoral Code primarily, as well as a number of other laws that are addressed in the report. Those provide an adequate legal basis for the elections and contain important measures to broaden political and sectoral representation. The repeated postponements and relatively late changes to the electoral system have, however, affected legal certainty ahead of the elections. They have also increased the demands for voter education and shaken stakeholder confidence to some degree. At this point, clear and authoritative guidance, effective voter education, institutional readiness, and consistent and equal application of the rules will be critical for strengthening legal certainty and credibility moving forward. Next slide, please. Many stakeholders interviewed by the mission believe that the postponements have fundamentally altered the playing field by allowing significant amendments to their legal framework, as well as political realignments to take place over the past year. There have been, for instance, significant political moves between the pre-election assessment mission deployed by ANFREL in 2025 and the one this year. This will be reflected a bit later, but to show that this is an evolving landscape and that the postponement of the elections have contributed to this evolution. There have also been mixed opinions among stakeholders regarding the extension of the first term of the incoming Bank Samoro Parliament, because that will be the new elected parliament will be in place until June of 2031 under Republic Act number 12-317, which has rescheduled the elections for September 14. This extended term of nearly 5 years instead of 3 can foster either unity or division depending on the outcome of the elections and the perceptions of the elections. So that would be extremely important because, of course, post-election, the stability will be everything for the peace process and for the accomplishment of the aspirations of the Bank-Sommer Organic Law. As well, amendments to sexual elections introduced by BAA number 88 earlier this year were unequivocally denounced by stakeholders from the affected sectors. So those include youth, women, the ulama, there's as well traditional leaders, for instance. Those stakeholders have spoken against the amendments, primarily because, according to them, the amendments go against the spirit of broader representation that was expressed in the Bank-Sommer Organic Law. So while we do understand the amendments make the sectoral elections a lot simpler administratively, the intent behind it has been somewhat subdued by the opening at large of sectoral elections. Reserve seats in most countries are elected by people from among those sectors and not the public at large. So this is somewhat unique to BARMM elections. Next slide, please. There are also a few other shortcomings in the legal framework that are not unique to elections in BARMM, but instead reflect shortcomings in the broader legal framework for elections in the Philippines. This includes, for instance, alleged instances of gerrymandering and malapportionment in the delimitation of electoral boundaries, and that is fueled by a fundamentally political rather than technical boundary delimitation process, because in Bangsamoro, just like in the Philippines in general, it is parliamentarians that are vested the responsibility of drawing constituencies. And there are best practices at the international level where it can be technical committees or election management bodies with public inputs, so that the constituency delimitation can be less politicized. So that would be something that stakeholders can consider moving forward. As well, legal certainty and the right to a legal remedy have been undermined by long timelines at the Supreme Court level, which do not ensure the timely resolution of election-related proceedings. For instance, challenges to BAA number 86, which is the redistricting law, BAA number 88, which contains amendments to the electoral system, as well as to COMELEC's cancellation of the accreditation of Moro Ako party, all remain pending before the Supreme Court and are unlikely to be resolved before election day. So while we understand that this is the legal framework in place in the Philippines, this introduces some level of uncertainty because cases can be resolved post-election and potentially affect the framework ipso facto. So not ideal in this case. Moving on to electoral administration itself, the mission has noted robust electoral preparations and institutional readiness for the BARMM elections. This reflects findings from the previous mission reports in the Philippines by ANFREL, especially the 2022 and 2025 national and local elections. We have felt for years that election management is fairly strong in the Philippines and that COMELEC is a competent election management body, one of the most transparent and professional, at least in the region, and that continues to be the case. Mission interlocutors as well hold mostly positive views of COMELEC and the BEO, the Bank-Sommer Election Office's independence, capacity, transparency, and engagement with civil society and political stakeholders. So that is a clear positive heading into the election, that there is a relationship of mostly trust across stakeholders established. However, I need to point out that some mission stakeholders have also expressed doubts as to the capacity of COMELEC to fully implement procedural safeguards on election day and prevent interference by ill-intentioned elements, which could be electoral board members or third parties. I will expand on this in the next slide. These concerns include worries that historic patterns reported in BARMM in previous elections of voter intimidation, controlled areas, the use of pre-shaded ballots, and or flying voters who may vote in separate polling station on election day may again take place in these elections. Some stakeholders have voiced concerns that safeguards and institutional measures taken might not fully prevent this from happening, especially in the more remote areas of BARMM. So that is, of course, something that we will keep an eye out as we observe and as we collect stakeholder inputs during and after election day. There is broad scrutiny from political stakeholders, domestic and international election observers, and the media, and that is great, but that also needs to be sustained throughout election day and the post-election to ensure transparency and trust in the electoral process. Because, again, the perception of these elections will be everything going forward. We also want to highlight that there are strong transparency measures in the legal framework and in the implementation of the elections, which include, for instance, the access granted to dominant, majority, and minority political parties, as well as major political parties, which, for instance, include access to the data centers, access to polling stations, and access to precincts results, which are very strong by regional levels. Also, that includes the accreditation of citizens' arms and other recognized observer groups by COMELEC. So we see that in a very positive light. However, the mission has also identified some room for improvements as there are gaps in the information made available to the public. A few brief examples here for the consideration of COMELEC and the Bank Summer Election Office. For instance, we have found that there is no public docket for complaints available for BARMM. That is something that we would love to see so that everybody can track the status of different complaints. We do acknowledge that COMELEC has been providing regular updates on certain cases, but having a docket of complaints makes that easier and more transparent. As well, we have found that the full text of some of COMELEC's decisions regarding party accreditation or candidate qualification has not been made available to the public, and that is something that we would recommend. And a third example would be the availability of maps of the different electoral constituencies. While the areas under each constituencies are known, maps would actually make it a lot easier for voter education by all stakeholders. So that is a good practice that would also recommend for your consideration. Moving on to my last slide, please. A few words on the rest of electoral administration findings. The accreditation process for candidates and political parties was perceived mostly positively by political stakeholders. However, the timeline for accreditation was very compressed, which led, according to some parties, to extra challenges and hurdles in filing the required documentation. The automated election systems or system or AES is generally seen as credible and is not a concern that was especially flagged by stakeholders. We have also noted improvements, small improvements over the 2025 national local elections, such as heavier ballot paper and different markers to be used, which are expected to facilitate voting on election day. Also, the fact that these BARMM elections will not be synchronized with any national election allows COMELEC and the BEO to allocate more resources and lower the number of voters per precinct, which is a welcome innovation and should facilitate the flow of people on election day. So that's something we see as a positive until, of course, we see in practice what it results in on election day. Also, the inclusion of pictures of candidates and logos of political parties on the ballot, something that is mandated by the Bank Summer Electoral Codes, is a welcome development for voter awareness and something that we commend the Bank Summer Transition Authority for thinking of and the COMELEC for implementing. And finally, voter registration has been assessed as satisfactory by most stakeholders, and that has not been flagged as a concern at this time. I will now leave the floor to my colleagues for the rest of the findings. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Amel. Before Ms. May takes over, I'll just quickly announce to the participants to use the Q&A function or type their questions using the chat box before you take over right? And what you can do is you can use this time to just frame the questions, because after this we are going to have a 15 to 20 minutes Q&A session with the electoral analysts. So over to you, Ms.
Thank you, Rana. So allow me to continue the presentation of the mission's findings. I'll be focusing on the political polarization and security, representation and barriers to participation, and voter education and access to information. So election-related violence in the BARMM is driven by familiar factors: RIDO, political rivalries, private armed groups, and residual extremist elements. These are structural features of political competition and not new to this cycle. To manage that risk, COMELEC and the PNP, the AFP, and the Joint Security Councils identified 108 areas of concern, classified red, orange, yellow, or green. Lanao del Sur alone has 21 of the 27 red category areas, the highest concentration in the BARMM. That classification process is contested. Some see it as overly reliant on historical data, backward-looking rather than predictive. The region-wide gun ban similarly draws mixed assessment. On one hand, enforcement has been active with checkpoints, early confiscations, and high compliance reported in the island provinces. On the other hand, other stakeholders doubt its reach because weapons are often unregistered and some can be stored at home rather than carried. And some stakeholders have reported that enforcement is weaker in island areas than in areas of concern. However, we also want to make a point that overall security preparations have been well coordinated and substantial, with additional troop deployments from neighboring regions by the military and police. Next slide, please. Stakeholders describe growing divisions within MILF-linked networks. Support increasingly split between Chairman Ahad Ibrahim, the UBJP, and the Interim Chief Minister Makakua and the BFP, both seen as leading contenders. This matters beyond party rivalry. Whichever bloc prevails will shape how the peace process political track moves forward. And the report notes that prolonged tension has already generated anxiety over the future of the peace process. Another finding I want to underline about security is when we ask stakeholders what worries them the most, the answer was not isolated violence. It was the risk of post-election violence tied to whether the results are seen as fair and credible. And this concern was raised very frequently across the mission's consultation. A broader point that the mission makes is that reported incidents alone should not be the sole measure of electoral security, where political authority, clan structures, and armed influence overlap. Coercion can shape voter behavior quietly through controlled and captive voting. A quiet precinct is not necessarily a free one. An important nuance for reading election day security data. Next slide, please. Moving on to representation and barriers to participation. The Bangsamoro Organic Laws provisions for broader representation, reserved seats, the women's quota, sectoral representation are widely welcomed as important democratic milestones. However, the mission flagged real implementation risks. Most parties met the 30% requirement for party list nominees, but compliance was largely with the letter and not the spirit of the law. Save for a few parties, women were placed in low unelectable positions in the nominee list. As the report puts it, the as far as practicable qualifier handed parties a ready-made exit hollowing out the promise of meaningful representation for women. In district races, with no gender requirement, only 14 out of 107 candidates are women. In fact, one province has no woman candidate. More positively, we saw how the non-Moro indigenous peoples process drew engagement across NMIP tribes and reflected the meaningful participation through their own customary laws and practices. Next slide, please. Amel has already spoken about this earlier in the legal framework, but I think it is worth repeating. The reform of sectoral elections drew particular concern. The seats for women, youth, settlers, ulama, and traditional leaders are now going to be elected at large. Sectoral organizations are disproportionately disadvantaged because they lack the network, funding, and institutional setup to run region-wide campaigns the way established parties can. Persons with disabilities are among the least represented groups. They face inaccessible voter education, physical barriers at polling places, and uneven accommodations. There are also candidates with disabilities. IDPs and other underserved groups face a similar gap, needing targeted information and adequate special voting arrangements. Next slide, please. So turning to voter education and access to information. As the first parliamentary elections in the country, understanding of the parliamentary governance remains low among most voters, especially with the 3 tiers of our party list, district, and sectoral seats, and how the chief minister is elected. Some stakeholders estimated that a larger majority of the voters still lack a basic understanding of the system. Voter education efforts remain insufficient in reach and accessibility, particularly for NMIP and geographically isolated communities. Repeated changes to the election calendar and legislative amendments have forced constant revisions, disrupting planning, especially for civil society organizations. Access to electoral information is shaped heavily by family and community networks, and increasingly by digital platforms, particularly Facebook. While uneven connectivity and language barriers further constrain access, materials are also predominantly in Filipino, with insufficient localization into languages used in remote communities. As the mission puts it, the principal gap is not simply awareness of voting procedures, but understanding what voters are electing and how the system translates votes into representation. Timely, neutral, localized, and accessible voter education is key to informed choices and reduce vulnerability to manipulation. Thank you for your attention. I want to hand it over to our colleague, Rilu.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for the opportunity. So I would be focusing on the campaign environment and some of the campaign practices that we observed during the mission. So in terms of the political competition for this election, the competition appears vibrant with 631 candidates, 16 are regional parliamentary political parties, and 26 parliamentary or sectoral organizations competing in this election. We also had the separate tribal assemblies for the non-Moro indigenous people, which also saw quite vibrant participation. However, given the current context and the political polarization within BARMM, this also means that the electoral field is highly fragmented, with parties representing different political networks, former revolutionary movements, clans, and sectoral interests. Multi-party environment can broaden political participation and offers greater choice, but some of the late resolutions of accreditation and disqualification cases earlier in the year has added to the legal complexity of an already unfamiliar electoral system. The large number of parties and shifting political alignments may also make it harder for voters to distinguish among party platforms and allegiances. And this is something that we observed when we spoke to candidates, especially because voters were not sure if one of their parties are not represented in the district's seats. So there is confusion over who they should vote because there are these 3 separate tiers of voting. What it also means is that we need to reinforce the effective voter education and substantive issue-based campaigning. Additionally, there was also perception that state institutions or national political actors are favoring particular parties or factions, which could similarly affect confidence in the impartiality of the electoral process. Next slide, please. In terms of campaigning, we observe significant disparity in campaigning resources, organizational capacity, and visibility among contestants. When we were, our field mission was before the actual campaign period started, but we saw parties gearing up for the campaign period, and their campaign strategies were largely dependent on the resources and networks that they had. So we saw larger parties benefiting from the superior resources, wider networks, and geographical reach they had compared to smaller parties with fewer access to campaigning and also less political experience. And as mentioned by Ma'am May and also Amal before, sectoral candidates reported similar challenges in matching the financial resources, networks, and viability of established political actors. And one of the very visible impact of this is for the sectoral seats, most of the campaigning and competition is being controlled by the leading political parties, where out of the 24 out of the 26 parliamentary sectoral organizations, 16 of those are political party wings, sectoral wings of political parties. And this is a stark comparison to last year, where we saw over thousands of sectoral organizations actively trying to participate in the election. So in terms of campaigning and the political competition, sectoral organizations have been somewhat sidelined because of the changes in the sectoral election method. We also found that BARMM's dispersed geography and compressed campaign period further disadvantaged the smaller and sectoral organizations, whereas the larger political parties were able to take advantage of their established political machinery and networks. Another persistent concern that came out from interlocutors was that the influence of entrenched political parties, political clans and dynasties, interference from national government, and uneven access to party finance continues to hinder fair electoral competition and party institutionalizations. While these conditions do not in themselves demonstrate an unfair electoral process, it highlights disparities that may affect the ability of different political and sectoral actors to compete effectively. Next slide, please. Yeah. Looking at some of the campaign practices, the most stark and again, a recurring concern was the issue of vote buying and abuse of state resources. Vote buying was described as a widespread and normalized practice in BARMM, and so there is concern that this could become an issue for this election. One of the main concern is because of lack of awareness among the broader voter base, this vote buying could be one of the determinants of how they vote. Similarly, abuse of state resources was also a concern that interlocutors, political party candidates, as well as independent candidates raised, and there were concerns regarding the timing and increased visibility of government assistance programs, especially in the last couple of months, and this is being identified as an incumbent advantage. And political regulatory loopholes currently makes it harder to distinguish between legitimate government activities and partisan political activities. So it's difficult to say whether, let's say, service delivery or aid distribution can be perceived as a political activity. So in addition to these two practices, we were also made aware of false or misleading information, and parties also expressed challenges in digital campaigning, because most of the campaigning of parties are being done online. So with the connectivity issues, they are finding it challenging to reach their electorate or voter base. There were also concerns that were raised about different forms of coordinated or command voting and the use of political families or patronage networks to mobilize voters. While such practices do not necessarily constitute electoral violations, they become problematic where political influence is accompanied by coercion, misuse of public resources, or interference with voters' ability to make a free and informed choice. Next slide, please. So taken together, this assessment highlights both the promise and fragility of BARMM's democratic transition. The report sets out recommendations to address these key issues, and this broadly covers areas on electoral process, campaign finance, and accuracy in information, security and impartiality, broad participation, voter education, and transparency and independent scrutiny. So next slide, please. So our most immediate recommendations and priorities are to ensure legal certainty and electoral preparedness by way of ensuring legal certainty, transparent election administration, and consistent implementation of electoral procedures. Security and impartiality remains a priority, so it is important to ensure impartial and transparent security arrangements and equitable access for voters and electorals across the region. And this goes for both the mainland and island regions as well. On voter education and informed participation, it's very important to intensify accessible, localized, and practical voter education, and to ensure reasonable accommodations are made for vulnerable voters, especially those who are, especially in areas where literacy is an issue and also accessibility is an issue. Next slide, please. So in terms of campaign financing and information accuracy, it's one of the most critical areas is to ensure that the regulations against vote buying, abuse of state resources, and non-compliance with social media and AI-generated campaign contents are enforced consistently and fairly across political actors. And it's also very important that the existing frameworks are strengthened and people are made aware of the avenues to raise complaints and to seek proper actions against these violations. Finally, on transparent and independent security, because the election means so much to the Bangsamoro people, it contributes to a broader peace process. It's very, very important that the elections are that independent civil society organizations, media, and observers, both from Philippines and abroad, are able to independently scrutinize the entire peace process, entire election process. Next slide, please. So in closing, our observation finds that the September 14th election carries significance well beyond the conduct of a normal election. It's an opportunity to honor decades of struggle, negotiation, compromise, and institution building by demonstrating that political competition in Bangsamoro can be settled peacefully and democratically. The mission therefore calls on all stakeholders, the national government, electoral and regional institutions, security forces, political parties, candidates, civil society organizations, and communities to exercise restraint, uphold the rules, and protect the freedom of every Bangsamoro voter. The measure of this historic election should not simply be that the election finally takes place, but it should also be done in a way that peaceful, credible, and broad participation is ensured, providing that Bangsamoro people with an outcome that they can trust and offering the wider region a compelling example of a peace process sustained through democratic choice. So details, our report includes provides more detailed examples within further recommendations, and also this is a very compressed presentation of the report. So we are happy to take on questions. So over to Rana. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Filu, and thank you to all our amazing panelists to give a comprehensive and detailed presentation. I hope all the participants enjoyed it. We now open the session for Q&A. And like I mentioned earlier, kindly use the Q&A feature, or you can just put your questions directly in the chat box. I think it would also be helpful for our internal team if you can also put your names and organizational affiliation when you ask your question. So, but again, there were some questions and comments already, so maybe we can begin with that. So I think there was a request for media interviews as well. So we would just quickly want to announce that for media interview requests, including requests involving members of the mission, please address them to the mission director at our official email ID, anfrel@anfrel.org. We are also going to copy and paste it in the chat box for your easy reference. So our team will certainly coordinate with you at the earliest and with the appropriate person and get back to you. So thank you so much. Yeah, so I think maybe we can start with the questions that we already have with us, and then we'll move to the new questions that we get. Right, so we have a few questions by our chairperson, Dr. Gopal. He also acknowledged all the distinguished panelists for their amazing presentations. And the first question pertaining to security, I think Ms. May would be a suitable person or analyst to answer that question. So the question goes like this: where are the genuine election risk hotspots, and can voters and observers safely access them? Security radius. Over to you, Ms. May.
I didn't realize I turned off my video. Thank you for that question. So I think the situation in the BARMM is very fluid when it comes to elections. The incidence of violence always somehow increases, but I also want to make a point that there are active incidents of violence ongoing, and so it is important that the security sector and the COMELEC are actually monitoring the situation in terms of our own findings of where the violent incidents are happening. A lot of them are happening in Maguindanao del Sur, for example, and some areas in Maguindanao del Norte as well. I think the important thing to take note of when we're looking at the hotspots is that the security sector is monitoring the situation closely, and then we can also look at how the COMELEC is assessing the situation on the ground, because it's very fluid. The elections are coming up in less than 2 weeks, and so whether or not there will be an increase, we will have also to observe closely.
Thank you, Ms. May, for answering that question. Yes, Brisa.
Yeah, thank you, Rana. Thank you, Mamay. And I just wanted to add also, because there's an important question with regard to access to observers, because we have brought this concern for so many times, of course, that if or independent observers, including accredited citizens arms, whether it's and whether it's domestic or international observers, actually access these areas freely and meaningfully. So that's the challenge, Dr. Gopal, because the polling place or voting centers may technically be accessible, but of course the question is whether meaningful observation requires more than that physical entry, because the problem, as we have observed during the pre-election, is that observers at least should be able to travel to areas of concern, enter and remain in polling centers, especially those controlled areas, observe the critical procedures, speak with relevant stakeholders where appropriate, and move between locations without unnecessary restriction, intimidation, excessive security control, or dependence on political actors. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Brisa. Yeah, so the next question is on legal certainty, and I think the right person to answer this is either Amel or again you, being our mission director, Brisa. So the question is the electoral framework finally settled, or can further legal regulatory changes still affect the elections?
Thank you, Rana. The answer to is the electoral framework finally settled is yes, but because there are cases pending before the Supreme Court, as I mentioned. So there are different types of cases. First, there are judicial review cases against two. So there are petitions against two bills that modify the electoral framework, which are BA 86 and 88 that were passed earlier this year. And those are considered final unless the Supreme Court decides to overturn them, which at this point we don't anticipate, but could happen. And if it does happen, that will most likely be after the election. For instance, the redistricting law BA 86 is the outcome of of the Supreme Court overturning the previous redistricting law last year, which is why the elections that were planned for October of 2025 had to be rescheduled. So it is possible. But that's really judicial review. At this point, the Bank Sovereign Transition Authority cannot really change the rules of the game otherwise. But then there are also administrative decisions that could potentially be overturned. Most likely, there are one individual candidate, and one party have been disqualified by the Comelec. And there was an appeal in front of the Comelec. Both decisions were upheld by the Comelec en banc. And at least the decision to cancel the registration for Moro Ako Party was appealed before the Supreme Court. I'm not sure yet about the candidate itself. So it is possible that the Supreme Court could overturn this. This is not judicial review. This is just the final instance of appeal in terms of candidate accreditation. So legal certainty is mostly good, but again, the timeline of Supreme Court adjudication makes it that it's not 100%, and that's an issue in the Philippines in general. At this point, we don't anticipate any disruptions, but we also cannot rule them out. Neither can anybody conclusively. I don't know if you want to add anything on that, Brisa. Okay.
Okay, so we are good. So I think for next couple of questions, I will be requesting Ms. May. The first question is regarding the representation and barriers to participation. The question goes like this: who potentially and effectively remains excluded despite having formal electoral rights?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think in the presentation, we already identified them. Persons with disabilities, because they have no access to accessible voter education, and then also those who are living in isolated areas. A lot of them are also non-Moro indigenous peoples. And and then the internally displaced persons, because of the lack of mechanisms to allow them to vote.
I think there is another question which is regarding BAA number 88. So the comment is that your assessment notes that BAA number 88 shifted the selection of sectoral representatives to direct plurality voting except for NMIPs, and that some stakeholders felt that this departed from the spirit of the BOL. So the question is, could you elaborate on what you heard from the sectors themselves? Were there any concerns about their representatives being elected by the broader BARMM electorate rather than by members of their respective sectors?
I can maybe answer this one without directly quoting from any of the interviewees because we also are protecting our sources as observers. What came out from quite a few of the interviewees from those sectors was disappointment at the changes introduced by BAA 88. Because the idea behind those 8 sectoral seats, so there are 8 seats out of 80 that are reserved to certain sectors. And BA 88 changed the mode of election for 6 of these. The NMIP, so number indigenous people, elections are still protected. These are according to tribal assembly, so that was not changed. The other 6, according to last year's legal framework, would have been elected only by people from those sectors, and now because administratively, well, it's a lot more simple. That's the argument that was advanced by people who pushed for the reform. So the candidates must be accredited, must be submitted by sectoral organizations or political parties' sectoral wings, but the election itself will be on the ballot on September 14, and all voters will be able to elect. So the sentiment from those sectors was disappointment that, for instance, the women's representative will be elected by the electorate at large. So that includes both women and men. Same for youth. There will not be only youth who votes. And in some cases, people have argued that this would politicize the process further, rather than a discussion among the sector on who could be the best representative, that this allows greater reach for political parties that have greater resources to campaign and to get their candidates passed. So that is the concern, that technically representation will be there, but the substance of the representation, that's something we'll have to look at post-election to see the outcome. But that was the comments. That's an explanation on the comment. I see Breeza has a few things to add on this.
Yeah, thank you, Mel. To probably add with regard to the word disappointment, because the disappointment is coming from the main concern with regard to genuine sectoral representation. Because if, according to them, if sectoral representatives are elected by the broader BARMM electorate, rather than primarily by members of their own sectors, just like what they did during the 2025, wherein they registered the youth, the women, sectoral organizations. So the question becomes, to whom are they ultimately accountable? So some stakeholders worried that broader, of course, political machinery popularity could outweigh the actual preference of the sector, and at the same time, others see direct election as providing a broader democratic mandate. So the issue actually is with regard to the balance of the legitimacy and the ability of the sectors to genuinely choose their own representatives.
And maybe just as a final comment, we have expanded on this in the report as well, so please feel free to read it. Breeza mentioned political machinery, so there are 2 sides to the argument, which we do reflect in the report. One is that opening at large could make political machineries more effective in the election. The alternate side of the argument from proponents of BA88 is that the process was captated by a certain political machinery already last year, and so opening at large would actually free the process somewhat. So we're not judging only, we're not passing judgment, we're only sharing the sentiment from sectoral representatives on this. That's all.
Thank you so much, Brisa and Amel. There is another question. Maybe we can take this question since this will continue the flow. This is by Well Fennis from I Am for Peace. So the question is, or the reflection is that the sectoral representations to the BARMM Parliament has been grabbed by parties and dynasties. So this must be a campaign policy for the civil society organizations day after September 14, 2026. So if anybody wants to comment on that.
Well, I think that's largely what we just commented on, that there is the argument that opening sectoral representation opens potential for parties to leverage their influence. And then there's the flip side of the post-election, depending on the outcome and depending on the feelings of stakeholders. I don't think we have further comments at this time.
Okay. So I think there are a couple of questions more, but before that, maybe I can share another reflection from one of our participants. So it's more of a suggestion for us. And the suggestion is to strengthen the monitoring of the full electoral cycle. So the participant has stressed that how it is important to strengthen monitoring from pre-election preparations through election day, counting, transmission, consolidation, and post-election processes. And there is a need to expand independent monitoring to ensure adequate and diverse observers, monitors across the BARMM, including areas where access and security may be challenging, to build confidence in the results of elections of Bangsmaro. And this is something that NDI and ANFREL has already been coordinating on and has already been doing. And we are also happy that it's more of a full electoral cycle. But maybe I can invite our mission director if she wants to reflect on this suggestion.
No, yeah, actually, thank you for those reflections, suggestions, and recommendations, because it also provide meaningful and added value, of course, of international election observation mission like this. But we can expand further, Rana, so we can cater or answer more questions in the chat box. Thank you.
Thank you. So there is a question pertaining to integrity. How serious are vote buying, political financing violations, uneven playing field, coercion, and misuse of state resources? And are they being enforced against? So maybe since Rilu reflected on campaign environment, so maybe you can answer this question, Rilu.
Thank you, Rana. This was a concern that was raised by, I think, almost all of the stakeholders that we spoke during the mission. So the broader understanding or acceptance is that vote buying is inevitable in our parts of the world, and this is one of the main reasons for persistent vote buying is linked to poverty and economic dependence, especially on political actors or leaders within their communities. So vote buying is something that most of our interlocutors highlighted, but we did not come across, we did not have any evidence of vote buying or vote selling, and this perhaps, I think, would, maybe we were, our timing did not allow us to see it. So what the underlying issue here is that people know that this could happen. So there are, again, fears, especially with smaller parties or independent candidates who will not be able to partake in these practices, that they would be disadvantaged in some way. So what is more important is the existing frameworks needs to be strengthened, especially on vote buying. Another issue that was highlighted by the stakeholders is on the abuse of state resources, the timing of some of the announcements, the visits from the national government to some of that could be perceived as support or support to certain parties. These were things that interlocutors were highlighting, and so while we couldn't independently again verify that whether this is political, because the laws make it, the existing laws makes it harder to specifically say, okay, this is this is abuse of state resources. So there is need to look at the law and strengthen. But we've also observed since our mission and even during our time this is something that a lot of the domestic observers and watch groups are aware of. So there is public watchdog function is being taken up by some of the domestic players, so which is helpful and can help build the integrity around the system. And similarly, while the cases with Homalak, initially when we were there, I think there weren't any formal cases of vote buying or abuse of state resources submitted, but we have seen since then instances where individuals or political actors are actually taking it up with the relevant regulators. So there's hope that people would be more vigilant and they are looking for solutions to this long persistent issue. So the work needs to be done by both parties, and some of these are again reflected in our report and included in our recommendations as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rilu. Amel, you want to add something?
Yes, just an additional comment on use of state resources. That is something we're planning to discuss further in the final report as well. We will, for instance, do a review of the legal framework on use of state resources in the Philippines according to international standards. Historically, ANFREL has noted that the Philippine election laws are a bit lax on this, and that's something that we most likely will continue submitting recommendations for. Also, as Rilu has mentioned that the timing did not work out so great for this because the main deployment for this pre-election assessment was the second half of July when the campaign period had not yet started, and that's when most of the legal restrictions on vote buying start getting into effect. So we were there just prior to that. That's why we're not commenting at this stage. We want to collect more data. We want to see as well the enforcement of Comelec's Contra Bigay committee in the coming weeks. So there will be an assessment of the law, of the enforcement of the law, of stakeholder feedback on this. It's a bit early for us to make a statement, and we don't want to prejudge either, considering that we're right in the middle of the campaign. So. Noted, please follow for more comments is what I would say at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Amel and Rilu. Rilu, there is one more question regarding voter education. So the question goes like this: do ordinary voters actually understand the new parliamentary system, districts, parties, and voting procedures well enough to make an informed choice? And this is my favorite question. So what do you do?
I think there was again concern that the level of information and understanding was not consistent across the region. So especially in communities which are far-flung or in communities where literacy is an issue, understanding of this significant change in the political system would require time. But since BARMM has also is having in the challenges that we have identified here this time around, there might be certain how people vote. So controlled voting was something that that did come across. So in a context like BARMM, where political dynasties and local leaders play a huge role, this is something that that is a worry for stakeholders across, especially from vulnerable groups. So I don't know whether we are in a position to say all voters are informed, but there is a concern that there is an information gap and there are challenges in getting this information across. So one of the key challenges that we find in terms of voter education is some of the voter education efforts are so close to the election, people are really not given the choice to take a decision on it. So in context like in parts of our parts of the world, it's important that there needs to be longer term development on civic education to actually facilitate voter education and understanding of the system. What has also confused voters is that the three-tier system of voting. So whether if say if their political party is not on the other two, on the district or on the sectoral seats, so they're not sure who they should then vote for. So there are confusions like this, and these kind of confusions can make them more vulnerable for other influences and coercion from leaders. So that's something that we did come across. So definitely voter education should be a priority in the run-up for this election.
Thank you. Thank you so
Yeah.
much, Rilu. You want to add more, Rilu? Sorry.
Oh, no. If
Okay.
anyone else wants to add, please feel free.
Okay, sorry. I think we are almost done with the Q&A session, but there is one question regarding the international election observer groups as well. So perhaps our mission director, Brisa Rosales, can take that question. So the question goes like this, Brisa: will there be other international election observer groups joining besides us, that is ANFREL-NDI? If yes and relevant, please mention the names of the organizations.
Thank you, Rana. Of course, I would leave the most definitive answer to Comelec because I saw Director Brea in the Zoom room. But what we know at this point is that aside from ANFREL and NDI, there will also be international presence coming from the EU diplomatic community, and then the Embassy of Japan, and then International Republican Institute or IRI. But just like what I mentioned, I would refer the whole list from Comelec on whether this will be deployed as a formal election observation missions or as diplomatic observers. Yeah.
Thank you, Brisa. So I think this is the time where we close the Q&A forum. So thank you everyone for a very engaging and productive discussion. Thank you, Brisa, Ms. May, Rilu, Amal, for answering all the questions. And before we move to the next and the last session, from my end, I would also like to acknowledge the presence of Comelec for taking out time and participate in the report launch of ANFREL and NDI. So to conclude our session and outline what is next, what lies ahead as ANFREL and NDI continue observing the upcoming electoral phase, I hand the floor back to Ms. Brisa Rosales.
Yeah, thank you, Rana. This will be very, very short because we have discussed at least the moving forward, the next steps from our joint ANFREL and NDI technical assessment mission. So actually by next week. So by next week, all of our international observers will already be here. We will just do our final briefing from Comelec and our own internal briefing, and then we will continue through the campaign, period observation, election day, and then in the immediate post-election period. Of course, we will also be having our own press conference. So probably this is a good opportunity to plug in our press conference 48 hours after the election day. It will be on September 16 at Alnor Hotel. So that will wherein the mission will be speaking about the election day and the campaign period assessment. But other than that, of course, I would like to take this opportunity to thank everyone who joined us today, especially to our electoral analysts, Amael, Rilu, and Mamay, and Manpreet also from NDI for this very substantive discussion. Because, of course, if there is one message I would like us to take away, it is that September 14 is not simply about holding an election. It is about the next stage of the Bangsamora's democratic and peace transition. So for ANFREL and NDI, our work also does not end with the release of this pre-election assessment report. Just like what I mentioned, we will return to the BARMM by next week and continue observing the developments on the ground and assess this process through election day and immediate aftermath. So we hope that our work contributes, even in a small way, to strengthen public confidence and support a peaceful and credible electoral process. Again, thank you to COMELEC, our partners, civil society, the diplomatic community, and most importantly, the Bangsamoro, who have generously shared their experiences and perspectives with us. So again, maraming salamat, and we look forward to continuing this journey with all of you.
Thank you, everyone. And our report is available on our website as well as all the social media platforms. So please take out time to read the report as well. Thank you.